So I think a lot of attention has been paid to the conceptual case for carbon pricing and the pros and cons of taxes versus emissions trading systems, and less attention in the literature has been paid to the quantitative impacts of carbon pricing at the country level. But this is clearly important for helping to move policy forward at the country level. And in addition, I think less attention has been paid to the trade-offs between carbon pricing and other policies that avoid a substantial increase in energy prices. But again, I think understanding the trade-offs between these instruments is important, because policies that don't impose a big increase in energy prices are perhaps politically a lot more acceptable. So I'm actually going to focus on these latter two issues mostly, but hopefully it'll provide some useful background to the discussion on aspects of carbon pricing. So at the IMF, we've been developing a spreadsheet model to analyze the impacts of carbon pricing and other carbon mitigation policies, and this model has been applied to 135 countries. The model starts out with use of fossil fuels and other fuels in the power generation sector, the transport sector, the household sector, and the industrial sector, and then we just project forward fuel use by sector using country-level estimates of GDP projections, assumptions about the income elasticities of demand for energy products, assumptions about the autonomous rates of technological change that might improve, for example, energy efficiency, and assumptions about international energy prices. And then the impacts of carbon pricing and other policies are going to depend on their proportionate impact on fuel prices, also a simple model of fuel switching in the power generation sector, and various price elasticities for electricity and fuels in other sectors and so on. So we typically assume that these price elasticities are between about 0.5 and 0.8 based on econometric evidence and results from other energy models. And I think that an advantage of our approach is that the model is very flexible. We can incorporate this wide range of countries. We can incorporate a wide range of alternative policy instruments. But clearly the model is very streamlined in some respects. For example, we're not looking at the dampening effect on fuel demand of gradual turnover of capital, and we're not looking at international trade linkages. So in this model, in this figure, which I think is probably our most important figure, the black squares are the percentage reduction in fossil fuel CO2 emissions in 2030 below business as usual levels with no mitigation that countries would need to implement their current pledges for the Paris Agreement. And the blue bars are the percentage reduction in fossil fuel CO2 emissions that would be induced by a $35 per ton carbon price in 2030. That would roughly double coal prices, but only increase pump prices for road fuels by about 5 or 7%. And the red bars are the extra emissions reductions from a $70 per ton carbon price. So right at the very bottom, you can see that for G20 countries as a whole, who collectively account for about 80% of global emissions, and the $35 per ton carbon price is easily sufficient to meet their mitigation pledges. And that's because of the disproportionate influence of China. China only needs a very modest carbon price to meet its mitigation pledge, and also the disproportionate impact of India. According to our analysis, India doesn't need to do anything to meet its pledge. It meets its pledge in the business as usual. On the other hand, there are other countries for whom even a $70 per ton carbon price is insufficient to meet their mitigation pledges. For example, Australia and Canada. And this wide divergence in the emissions prices that are implicit in countries' mitigation pledges reflects not only differences in the stringency of their commitments, as indicated by differences in the black squares across countries, but also differences in the price responsiveness of emissions, as indicated by differences in the blue and red bars across countries. In particular, emissions are especially responsive to pricing in countries that consume a lot of coal, like China, India, and South Africa. In this figure, the red bars here are the economic welfare costs of a $70 per ton carbon price in 2030. So these are just losses in consumer surplus in fossil fuel markets. And these costs are not too large, typically less than 0.5% of GDP in most cases, although they are more substantial in a handful of cases, emissions-intensive countries like China, India, Iran, South Africa. But the blue bars are the domestic environmental co-benefits of carbon pricing, particularly the reductions in air pollution deaths, but also reductions in traffic congestion and traffic accident externalities, minus the economic welfare costs. And as you can see, these blue bars, these net benefits, are for the most part, they're approximately zero or modestly positive for most countries. In a few cases, they're substantially positive in countries like China, India, and Russia, where there would be substantial local air pollution benefits from carbon pricing. So we think that many countries can actually move ahead unilaterally with carbon pricing and actually make themselves better off up to a point when they take into account the domestic environmental co-benefits. So we think that this free rider argument for inaction may have been overstated somewhat. If countries were to introduce a $70 per ton carbon price in 2030, this would be mobilizing substantial amounts of revenue, typically between about 1 and 3% of GDP for most countries, substantially more than that in a handful of emissions-intensive countries. We think there's a lot at stake in how the revenues from carbon pricing are used. For example, if revenues are returned in lump sum dividends, that's going to substantially increase the costs of carbon pricing relative to a carbon pricing policy where the large revenues are used to increase economic efficiency by, for example, cutting distortionary taxes or funding productive investments for sustainable development goals. And the figure here is providing illustrative calculations of the costs of different policies for the United States, where all these policies cut US emissions by 17% in 2020. And these welfare costs are capturing not only the losses in consumer surplus in fossil fuel markets, but also interactions with the broader fiscal system. And we can see that the costs of a carbon tax where revenues are returned lump sum is several times as high as the costs of a carbon tax where the revenues are used to increase economic efficiency, and the costs of a carbon tax with lump sum transfers can actually be significantly higher than that of a regulatory approach, such as a emission rate standard for the power sector. And that's because carbon taxes have a significant impact on energy prices, because they involve the pass-through of large amounts of carbon tax revenue in higher energy prices, and higher energy prices tend to slightly contract the overall level of economic activity, which in turn compounds distortions in labor and capital markets from the tax system. There might be some reasons why we want to combine carbon taxes and emissions trading systems. For some countries, emissions trading systems are going to be the most preferred approach on practical grounds. For example, there might be legal obstacles to carbon taxes. In the European Union, for example, I think that it was the unanimity requirement that precluded the use of a EU-wide carbon tax, and that's why instead they went for an emissions trading system. And in countries where the environmental agency is responsible for implementing carbon policy, such as in China, it's a lot more natural for the environmental agency to introduce a emissions trading system rather than integrating carbon charges into the system of fuel taxes that's instead collected by the finance ministry. But even when countries are relying on emissions trading systems, I think that carbon taxes can sometimes play a complementary role. In Europe, a number of countries like France, Ireland, and Sweden have implemented a carbon tax for emissions that are not covered by the trading system, so for transportation, heating fuels, and so on. Even within the emissions trading system, the United Kingdom has introduced a variable carbon tax to ensure that the ETS price plus the variable carbon tax equals a target floor price to help provide much more robust incentives for clean technology investment. And perhaps in some cases we want to reinforce an emissions trading system by integrating carbon charges into royalty regimes for extractive industries. For example, China's moving ahead with a trading system which won't cover a large amount of coal that's consumed in the residential sector. So perhaps for China it makes sense to combine the trading system with a carbon charge integrated into the existing royalty regime for coal that's applied at the mine mouth, and that would comprehensively cover emissions from coal use. Perhaps if they want to combine that with a rebate for firms that are under the emissions trading system to avoid double charging. Now, I think we need to be pragmatic. I mean, carbon pricing is clearly not going to be appropriate for every country. For example, in a particular country, maybe carbon pricing is just politically really difficult. Maybe in another country, energy prices are already on the high side relative to those in neighboring countries in the region. Maybe a country such as India is very concerned about increasing access to electricity consumption and is therefore reluctant to significantly increase electricity prices. So in these cases, maybe policymakers want to consider indirect pricing approaches which avoid a larger increase in energy prices. Traditionally, indirect pricing approaches have taken the form of regulations. And if we were to put together a package of comprehensive regulations that reduce emission rates in the power sector, reduce emission rates for vehicles, and promote improvements in energy efficiency across the economy, this package could, in principle, mimic most of the behavioral responses of carbon pricing. It wouldn't mimic all of them. For example, it wouldn't induce people to drive their cars less. But we know that regulatory approaches tend to be inflexible. They're not good about accommodating uncertainty over future technology costs. They're difficult to coordinate in a cost-effective manner across different sectors. So we think that an alternative to regulations, fee-bates, is a lot more promising. These provide a sliding scale of fees on products or activities with above-average emissions intensity and a sliding scale of rebates for products or activities with below-average emissions intensities. So, for example, if we applied fee-bates to the power generation sector, power generators would be paying a tax in proportion to the difference between the CO2 per kilowatt hour averaged across their plants and the industry-wide average emission rate multiplied by their output. And this table here is comparing the effectiveness of a wide range of mitigation instruments at cutting CO2 emissions compared with a broad-based carbon pricing policy, where here we've scaled all policies such that they impose the same explicit or implicit price on the CO2 emissions that they're affecting. And basically, any other instrument imposed in isolation is going to be either significantly or dramatically less effective than a carbon tax. For example, if a trading system is introduced but it's applied only to the power generation and large industrial sector, as for example in the EU, if that was applied across countries, then typically its effectiveness is about 50 to 70% of that of a broad-based carbon pricing policy across these different countries. On the other hand, just increasing road fuel taxes is very ineffective. That has effectiveness of something in the order of about 5 to 10% of that of a broad-based carbon pricing policy. But in the last column, it's worth noting that if countries were to put together a comprehensive package of indirect pricing approaches, fee-bates and regulations that reduced emission rates for power generation, reduced emission rates for vehicles, and improved energy efficiency, then that potentially has effectiveness of around 70% of that of a broad-based carbon pricing policy across different countries. So it's not that bad, actually. Just to conclude, obviously we think that ideally countries should be moving ahead with carbon pricing, and experience with Previous energy pricing reforms and carbon pricing reforms suggest that there are 4 ingredients that can help improve the prospects for a successful implementation of carbon pricing policies. One is just to phase in carbon prices gradually, so households and firms have time to adjust. Another is to have extensive consultations with stakeholders to get them on board to support the policy. It's also very important to have an extensive communications program to inform the general public about the rationale for the reform. Clearly, assistance programs for low-income households and displaced workers and to ease the transitions for vulnerable firms are also very important. And it's important to use the revenues in a visible way, ideally in a way that productively benefits the economy, and that's also viewed as equitable. Do I have time for one extra slide, or do you want me to stop now? 2 minutes, okay. I'll just do one extra slide. At the global level, even if countries were to implement their Paris mitigation pledges, that would only be cutting emissions in 2030 by about 1/3 of the emissions reductions in 2030 that would be implied by the 2 degrees Celsius target, the upper bound target of the Paris Agreement. And I think one key obstacle to scaling up mitigation at the global level is that advanced countries have greater responsibilities for reducing emissions, but by far and away the huge bulk of the low-cost emission mitigation opportunities are located in China and India. In addition, current pledges are rather opaque, reflecting in part a lack of international coordination over emissions pricing. So we think that policymakers should consider the possibility of a voluntary carbon price floor arrangement among large emitting countries as a complement to the Paris process. This would provide reassurance against losses in competitiveness. It could be equitable if advanced countries were subject to a higher price floor than developing countries, and it could be effective at scaling up mitigation. If, for example, advanced countries were subject to a minimum price of $50 a ton in 2030 and developing countries $25 per ton, which is pretty modest really, that would still roughly double emissions reductions over and above the emissions reductions that would be implied by countries meeting their Paris mitigation pledges. And I think this sort of price floor arrangement could be designed flexibly to accommodate carbon taxes, to accommodate emissions trading systems, and also to accommodate countries that want to move ahead with non-pricing approaches, so long as their emissions are in line with what they would have been had they met the price floor. So thank you. Stop there.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Augusta Wilson. I am now a lawyer with as you heard, a nonprofit group in New York City called the Climate Science Legal Defense Fund. And that is we focus on, frankly, very different area from what we're here to talk about today. But I am here largely because prior to joining CSLDF, I did a fellowship in energy law at NYU in New York. And while I was there, I did some research on linking of regional carbon markets, and sort of with a particular focus on North America. That paper looked very particularly at RGGI and at the Western Climate Initiative in the US, and you all are probably familiar with both of those carbon markets. And so what I'm going to talk with you about today is some of the conclusions and things that I found in that research, looking at sort of what are legal considerations that are important in thinking about linking regional emissions trading systems. And so I was looking at it very much from a US perspective when I did this research, but I hope that some of the broad conclusions are actually potentially useful even outside of US law in other jurisdictions that have some similar structures, and therefore some of the considerations might be relevant. So in the paper, I delved pretty deeply into some of the specifics of, first of all, why cap and trade is, argued by some to be a beneficial approach to carbon pricing, market-based approach, efficiencies, and things like that. And I also did some diving into some real specifics on what exactly two carbon markets would need to harmonize in order to link, in order to join and function successfully as a joint market operating joint auctions. But I have limited time here today, and being not an economist or a policy expert, but a lawyer, I'm gonna just sort of leap over that, and I think a lot of those really important points will probably be covered in other parts of our discussion today. So I'm going to jump into, let's assume we have two regional markets that would like to link and start running joint auctions. What are some of the important legal considerations? What are some important potential legal barriers that they might encounter, legal challenges, and what should they be thinking about in structuring this joint market to try to mitigate or avoid those? So in U.S. law, sort of from the perspective of the U.S., there are three really primary constitutional arguments that, in my opinion, would probably be the most likely to be raised if there were a really large-scale effort to create large linked markets that covered big parts of the U.S. and joined them with foreign jurisdictions. And I didn't mention this, and this may again be something everybody knows, but the Western Climate Initiative already links one U.S. state, California, with a Canadian province. And so that has already happened. And it's interesting that these legal challenges that I'm going to mention have not yet been brought, although that joint market has been operating for quite a number of years now. But if this were to start happening at a really big scale, if many U.S. states were to start to join up with other jurisdictions in North America or even in other parts of the world, potentially we'd start to hear about some of this. So all of the things I'm going to mention really just flow from the fact that the way the U.S. Constitution is structured, our system of federalism is structured, very simply, federal law trumps state law. A state law cannot conflict with a federal law, and that's sort of a very broad level universal rule, and all of these concepts in some way sort of flow from that. So there are three sort of main ideas, and there are huge amounts of very detailed and long-standing, complicated constitutional bodies of constitutional law that cover all of these. And I'm not going to go into a lot of detail. I'm going to be giving just a very sort of 30,000-foot view here. But the first I want to mention is called the Dormant Foreign Affairs Preemption Doctrine. Often sort of more simply referred to as the Foreign Affairs Doctrine. And the idea here very simply is that foreign affairs are the exclusive province of the federal government. They are not something that the state government, foreign affairs is not something that the state governments should be doing. And therefore, if the state governments start to engage in foreign affairs, those actions may be preempted, those actions may be invalidated because they violate this principle that this is really trumped by the federal government. The dormant word there stems from the fact that as this concept has been developed in the case law, even if the federal government has not actively, explicitly undertaken a policy in some particular area of foreign affairs. So for example, now the U.S. does not have any explicit treaty on climate, on carbon pricing, but nonetheless, this concept is so important that even though there might not be an explicit policy, should a state start to do foreign affairs work in that area, it might be preempted nonetheless. That's the dormant part. It could be preempted even though the federal government hasn't acted. So the Foreign Commerce Clause, Dormant Foreign Commerce Clause, which is the next one you see up there, in some ways it's a very similar idea. It stems from a very different body of case law. But in a lot of ways, the important concepts for the purposes of our discussion are the same. So the way our Constitution has been developed and interpreted, it is the exclusive province of Congress to regulate commerce, including foreign commerce. And therefore, again, if a state starts to itself regulate foreign commerce, it's treading into this area that it should not be in. And again, the dormant word, this may be true and a state's actions may be invalidated even if the federal government hasn't actively gone in and started regulating in any particular area. Nonetheless, the state may be forced to stay out. The last one is the Compact Clause, which is really directly in the Constitution, Article 1, Section 10, and it says pretty simply that a state is not allowed to enter into any compact or agreement with any other state or with any foreign jurisdiction or power without the approval of the Congress. So all of these are sort of relevant to the idea of if a state or a group of states wants to enter into some form of agreement that we are going to create a structure where we'll operate a joint carbon market, these concepts may be triggered. And you could certainly start to hear about them. So I want to now talk about a little about sort of how do those arguments look and what would be the strength of them. There are some very broad, and again, I'm not going to dive into some, the case law is really rich and really complex, and you could spend a long time talking about it and analyzing it. But there are a few just really high-level takeaways, themes that you see in a lot of the cases where the courts have interpreted these doctrines that I was just talking to you about, that I think are really relevant and useful to kind of think about in terms of how could such a joint market be structured. So the first I want to talk about is the idea that a state's actions are a lot less likely to be invalidated under one of these doctrines if the state is acting in what is considered a traditional area of state responsibility. States do, we have a system of federalism, states do have sort of this pretty wide swath of residual powers, and there are certain things that it's very much the province of the states to do. So there are sort of, you could see some really interesting arguments, pro and con. So for example, environmental protection in general is often considered to be very much within the state's traditional province of authority. It is the state's job to regulate its environment, to protect the environment of its citizens. And so if you look at joining a carbon market as that, as we are protecting our own state's environment against the effects of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, then you could argue pretty strongly that for a state to enter into a joint market like this and enter into some kind of MOU or other agreement with other jurisdictions, even foreign jurisdictions, to do so would still be within its traditional area of responsibility. And so that should therefore not be invalid under any of the doctrines that I just mentioned. And there's also the fact that climate change will inevitably affect not necessarily just sort of our traditional concept of environment, but some things that are very, very much within what has always been considered to be the state's responsibilities. So for example, it's going to have massive economic effects, and states are universally agreed to have the authority to regulate their own economies. It will have really important implications for things like land use decisions and zoning regulations. These are things that it is very much the province of the states to undertake. So looked at from that perspective, I think there are some very strong arguments that there shouldn't be any kind of preemption or invalidation because that, the states, by engaging in an agreement to link markets, is doing exactly what it should be doing exactly what it traditionally should be doing. There are some interesting counterpoints that I want to mention quickly. So one is that, the fact is, I'm not sure that the evidence that linking carbon markets in and of itself actually reduces greenhouse gas emissions. It might have all kinds of economic benefits. It might be an efficient approach. It might allow those pre-existing carbon markets to function better and more smoothly, but perhaps you could argue that you're not actually, the fact of the linking itself is not what's reducing emissions. It is where you set the cap in the stringency of the program. So the other point I wanted to mention is that the effects of linking jurisdictions, while there are lots of benefits, and again, I wish I had time to go more into it, but there are some substantial benefits, but those benefits are pretty inevitably going to be somewhat unevenly distributed between the jurisdictions that are linking. And to the extent that in some circumstances, you might actually find that one or more of the participating jurisdictions actually sees an increase in emissions, at least for a time. And so these are some counter-arguments that, is this really sort of, environmental protection, in the classic way that allows the state to argue that it is just protecting its environment. It would be really interesting to see how this would play out in the courts. But, again, I think overall the arguments would be very strong. That the states should not be preempted on that basis, that they could argue they're acting within their traditional areas of responsibility. So another sort of very overarching theme that I see as a takeaway from the case law is that a state is a lot more likely to be preempted or stopped from engaging in a joint market if it is found that this conflicts with an existing federal policy. So again, that idea that federal law just trumps state law. If states can't do something that really explicitly conflicts with an existing federal policy. So some interesting arguments there. In the US right now, is there an affirmative federal policy on point? I'm not sure that there is. The Trump administration, as everybody knows, has taken some very strong actions to indicate that it does not wish to regulate greenhouse gas emissions, and it has, said that it's going to pull the U.S. out of the Paris Agreement. But that's not an affirmative policy, and it also doesn't take the sort of very traditional form of an executive agreement or anything similar, a treaty, anything like that. So again, I think there could be some interesting back and forth, and it would be interesting to see how it played out. But again, I think some very strong arguments that there is not any actual federal policy on point to conflict with. So I'm gonna because I'm running short on time, I'm gonna buzz through here and talk a little bit about what were some of my most important takeaways. What are things that I would really encourage any jurisdiction? And again, this is, I was focused on U.S. States, but because we are not the only place that has a system of federalism and has sort of developed a constitutional concept of supremacy of federal law, some of these same issues may very much apply in places like Canada and Australia. I think, as was already mentioned, I think in the EU you're probably looking at a very different set of issues. But so a few of the important takeaways, things that I think it would be very helpful for jurisdictions to consider in order to best protect their program against these kinds of legal challenges if they wanted to develop a link. One, emphasize that the program is grounded in legitimate state regional, provincial concerns, and that it's intended to address local harms, as opposed to, we're trying to make a global policy and deal with a global problem. We're really trying to deal with our own local environment, situation, economy, etc. I think that's very helpful. And somewhat along those lines, avoid framing a linking agreement as a correction for the lack of federal action. Because again, then you're going to stay as far as possible away from sort of, we are taking the place of the federal government and acting in the place that the federal government should be. Anything that looks like that is going to tend to make a stronger argument that you are treading into federal territory. And so the less you can do that and the more you can frame it as a local issue, the better off you're going to be. Avoid any appearance of a desire to punish non-participating jurisdictions. And I have it on there, this actually stems very much from, as I mentioned briefly, our Commerce Clause and sort of concepts developed in our Commerce Clause cases. It is not allowable for a state to develop a policy that's intended to punish another state. So that's sort of an important concept to keep in mind. Consider using reciprocal legislation rather than an overarching binding agreement, because again, the less extremely formal and extremely binding, the more likely you are to avoid trouble. And finally, consider allowing for unilateral withdrawal. This is something that both of the existing systems, RGGI and the Western Climate Initiative in North America have done, and it's worked pretty well. Actually, Ontario withdrew pretty precipitously from the Western Climate Initiative not so long ago, and that was allowable under the rules. The program seems to have survived, and it does help to avoid some of these problems. So I'm going to leave it there, and thank you very much.
Okay, so my name is Onil Bergeron. I'm a senior advisor at the Ministry of Environment for the Quebec provincial government. I'm basically part of the divisions that runs the Quebec carbon market. So today I will talk about a few remarks on the market itself. Then we'll talk about some results and some consideration for linking and future work. So first things first, here's a sense of the context in Quebec in terms of GHG emissions. So in 2016, we were just above the 80 million tons mark. So that means just below 10 tons per capita. I'm not sure if we can see clearly, but the small portion of this bar chart is the electricity sector. So in Quebec, as you may know, the electricity is generated from hydropower. So there's basically no potential for emission reduction in that sector. The two biggest sectors emitting greenhouse gas are the transportation sector and the industry sectors. There are only two sectors that are not covered by the carbon market are the waste sector and agricultural sectors. The industrial sector is covered directly because large emitters are covered, and the transportation and building sectors are covered indirectly through fossil fuels distributors. So Quebec have two emission reduction targets that we set by law, if we can say. So there's a 2020 target, which is a 20% reduction under 1990 levels by 2020, and the 2030 target, which is 37.5 reduction under 1990. So the approach the Quebec put in place to tackle this issue and to achieve those targets is what we call an integrated approach. So there are two pillars to this approach. The first one is the cap and trade system. So the cap and trade system has two main objectives. The first objective is emission reductions by setting annual caps that are declining over from 1 year to the next. Then we guarantee that there are emission reductions in the covered sectors. The second objective, which is a secondary objective of the market, is to collect proceeds by selling at auction emission allowances. These monies are all sent to what we call the green fund, the Fonds Vert, and the Fonds Vert is basically the second pillar of this approach, in the sense that it finances the climate change action plans, which includes a whole set of programs to help mitigate emissions and also put some money on adaptation as well. So basically, the carbon market and the climate, the action plan both can achieve emission reductions. There are also complementary policies which they do not have climate change as their primary objective, but they are still in line with this integrated approach. And here I'm talking about the energetic transition policy, the electrification of transport policy, and the maritime policy as well. So some results to date, as you may know, the carbon market was implemented in 2013 and linked to California in 2014. So we went through two compliance periods. So the first one was 13-14, and the second one from 15 to 17. And we had 100% compliance for both of those compliance periods. So meaning that all covered entities surrendered the proper amount of allowances to cover their emissions. And the other nice results that we have is that we actually saw emission reductions in the industrial sector, so basically roughly 4% since 2012. And we also saw globally that the industrial sectors shows lower emission intensity, so lower emission per production units. And that's true for bigger industry and smaller industry, so it's spread out the whole spectrum. We also saw from the inventory that since 1990 there is a decoupling between emissions and economic growth. So basically, emissions are steadily going down and GDP is going up. We also have no evidence of carbon leakage, so there was no relocalization of industry because of a price on our carbon. So the economic impact of implementing the carbon market was limited. We also ran basically 23 auctions, 19 joint auctions. So this mechanism is going well, which allowed us to raise over $3.3 billion in proceeds to this date, and all this money is reinvested in the climate change action plan, as I said before. This slide is to show two examples of how the money is used to help mitigate, to provide financial support to different corporation to help them reduce their emission. So on the bottom left, it's the example from the Lion Bus company. So they basically develop electric buses, city buses and school buses, and they also, very recently, they launched this small truck, the small city truck for the transportation of goods. They receive financial support from the Climate Change Action Plan. So that's a great success story. The other example on the top right, it's a Raglan mine. So it's a mine up north Quebec that had to use diesel generators to produce its own electricity, and they decided to invest, and they received financial support to install a windmill that we can see on the picture. And this windmill can operate down to minus 40 degrees Celsius, and that helped them reduce drastically their emission reduction. And they also installed a second windmill, so that's another great story. Now let's talk about linking. The reasons why the carbon market would want to link, the first reason is because the climate change is a global issue, so it asks for a global solution. But more than that, there are economical benefits to link carbon markets. First one would be market liquidity, so you have it's easier for the players to make a transaction. The other advantage is it's a more cost-effective mitigation. So if you link markets, you have access to a greater pool of emission reduction projects, and you have access to cheaper also emission reduction projects. And also this could have a synergical effect that because two jurisdictions are aligned, they might also want to increase their emission reduction ambition. Another major advantage of to link markets is to provide an even playing field for economical actors. So basically, large corporations that have competitions, their competitors are in other jurisdictions. If they don't play by the same rules, one can have a competitive advantage over the other. So by linking, you provide more similar rules for everyone. In the context of the Quebec's carbon market, it's basically almost a necessity to link with another market, because the Quebec carbon market alone would not be sustainable in the long term. As we saw before, the cheapest reduction has already been made, mostly because of the hydroelectricity. So in the mid to long term, the carbon price would have to go way up to give a proper incentive to industries to make emission reductions, and the price would be so high that the business would have to shut down. So that's not what we want. Also, another thing is that by linking, you can also scale economies and cost. The WCI market, meaning the Quebec-California market, uses the same administrative tools and infrastructures, so the cost to operate the market is lower. And also, two brains is better than one, so that applies also at the jurisdiction level. If you have multiple jurisdictions, they can share their own experience, and the market is stronger because of that. Now, let's talk briefly about the types of linking. In the context of the WCI market, we are talking about a merger or integration linking, meaning that each jurisdiction will control its own program, have its own regulation, but they will operate jointly the regional market. So to do that, they have their own regulation, as I said, but they have to harmonize on a few key elements. And also, by having a joint market, you have all the compliance instruments are fully fungible, meaning that you don't know the allowances that you buy, you don't know if it's from Quebec or California, basically because it doesn't matter. It's a one and unique market. Auctions rules and market monitoring have to be the same, because we have to make sure of the integrity of the market. So we have to basically monitor the market as a whole. And also, because each jurisdictions have their own program, we are in a continuous we have continuous discussions to make sure that our regulations are harmonized, so we are in a daily contact. The WCI market is based on a collaborative effort that started in 2008 that laid down the basic recommendations to implement a carbon market in North America, and those recommendations provides for other types of linking. So it would be possible, it's not the case right now, but it would be possible to support other type of linking, for example, a one-way linking or linking with only a part of an economy. So that's something that would be possible. It's not something that we have done as of now, but there is flexibility there. A typical roadmap to linking is that first we would need to have a memorandum of understanding, an MOU on climate change by the jurisdiction, by the new jurisdiction that would like to link to the existing linked market. So that would show the political willingness of this market to link with our program, for example. And that would that would provide that would allow for institutional discussion to start and to build trust between the staff from each jurisdictions. After sometimes we have to talk about the technical stuff and basically talk about regulation, then the specifics of the regulations. At that time, we need a confidentiality agreement, so that all these discussions, as long as the regulation is not fully written and implemented, those discussions have to remain confidential. After that, a jurisdiction would need to show that it can run its own carbon market by itself. So that's what we did. Quebec and California ran their own carbon market for 1 year in 2013 before linking in 2014. And after that, there's a linking agreement that needs to be signed that allows for basically the fungibility of compliance instruments. So there's a couple of things here that Augusta already talked about. To assess the potential for jurisdiction to link, we have to make sure that the level of ambition in emission reduction is comparable to what it's already existent in the market, and the scope also of this carbon market have to be similar. There are also, as I said before, the design of this new carbon market have to be robust, but and also has to be aligned with the WCI market. Basically, you need full harmonization. The methodology to determine the caps have to be the same. The auction rules also need to be the same, and the transactions rules also, for example. And there are other provisions that they do not need to be exactly the same, but they need to reach a similar effect. For example, the offset protocols. We have in the WCI market, we have different offset protocols in California and Quebec, but the way they are used and monitored is very similar. As I said, if we want to have another player in our market, this jurisdiction will need to show that it can run its own carbon program. It will also need to show that if it has a strong enforcement capability. For example, in Quebec, if you don't surrender the proper amount of allowances after a compliance period, you need to provide 3 extra allowances on top of the one that is missing. So that's a pretty strong incentive for industry to surrender the right amount of allowances. And last point, the economical impact of a new jurisdiction joining the carbon market also needs to be assessed. Okay, just a quick word on the Ontario experience. As you know, the Ontario linked the WCI market that we needed to provide a lot of effort to help them build their own regulation, and they ran their program for 1 year before linking in 2018. And in June, the new government, the Ford government, announced that they would not participate in the next auction, and that they would repel their cap-and-trade program. So the same day of this announce, we had to shut down all transactions with Ontario to avoid dumping. So basically, by this experience, we showed that we can welcome a new partner in our market, but that we are also very flexible, and the market is stable and strong, that if the partner decides to unilaterally withdraw the carbon, the market is still stable. So, quick word on future work. In Canada, we have the federal government implemented its own carbon price, and it also recognized the Quebec carbon market, so this tax would not apply in Quebec. So we still make sure that this recognition is a long-term commitment. There's a new climate change action plan for after 2020 that will be released in the next months or so. There's a regulation modification that will come up next year for the allocation rules. So that's a technical stuff. We can talk about that after. And also in December, there's the conference of Party where they will discuss internationally transfer mitigation outcomes. So that's a major thing, because it's basically how to account for allowances bought in one jurisdiction and used in another one, and how do you count this allowance against the emission reduction target and avoid double counting. Other than that, there are other work on new offset protocols and ongoing collaboration and partnerships. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Onil. Though you had all those three presentations, and now we come to questions and answer. Maybe I can ask the first questions. If the floor wants to ask question, how it works. There's a microphone? Yeah. There are two microphones, and people who want to ask question can go to the microphone and asking their question. And the time you will take to go to the microphone, I will ask one question to Jan. You presented this idea of international arrangement on level of carbon price inside the countries, but in the current context with North America and Brazil, it's difficult to. How do you imagine this international agreement between which countries and when in 2 years? Because the time is very important, you know. Yeah. And so maybe.
Well, we think it has to be voluntary.
Yes.
So presumably the US wouldn't join immediately. So it has to be voluntary, and well, as soon as possible. I mean, the idea is that countries commit to imposing a minimum price. To operationalize it, it's a bit tricky because you need to compare pricing systems where perhaps in some countries there are exemptions to pricing. Perhaps in other countries they're adjusting pre-existing energy taxes at the same time. So we really need to track countries' effective carbon prices that take these exemptions and pre-existing energy prices into account. So we think that countries should commit to an increase in their effective carbon price, maybe $20 per ton over the next 5 years or something. And then you would need an independent agency to track their carbon prices and verify that they're
This
increasing them.
agency would be part of the current UNFCCC or outside?
Well-
Maybe under the auspice of the International Monetary Fund?
Possibly, but I mean, I think the OECD or the IEA would be more natural choices because they have a broader range of staff working on these issues.
It's very important from the governance issue. But please ask your question. If you can just introduce yourself before.
Thank you. Jim Stoddard, Boston University. One point of clarification and then a broader empirical question. On Mr. Parry's presentation, the first couple of graphs, and particularly the one that showed the costs versus the benefits of carbon pricing, I noticed very large benefits for Russia and I think for Iran. It was labeled on the graph as benefits from pollution reduction or something like that, but my own forecasts suggest that there'd be very large profits to natural gas industries as well that are concentrated in those countries. So I wondered, could you clarify, is that included in it? And I suspect it is. And the second broader point is I've found in doing my forecasts, which were presented on the first day on carbon pricing, that there's a very, on this issue of quantities versus prices, a classic distinction in the literature going back to Weitzman, that there's a very useful forecasting aspect of that by constraining either a future price vector or a future quantity vector of pollution, you can get essentially similar forecasts on carbon output. But of course that doesn't, I would never claim that that means it's equivalent in economic terms or even less so in broad social economic terms as we've been hearing, but that can be a very useful kind of cross-reference and consistency check in forecasting. So, welcome.
Thank you. Maybe we will ask the three questions and answer together. So, please ask your question.
Oh.
Yes?
Okay.
Immediately?
Hi.
And if you can be short, please.
Okay, I'll try my best. Gavin Cook, Environment Canada. Thank you all for your presentations. I've learned a lot. My question is in reference to the very first presentation, specifically one of the concluding slides that talked about the policy elements that could help improve the acceptability of carbon pricing. So in Canada, we have a carbon tax that is phased in and revenue neutral, which should in theory help best facilitate wide acceptability of carbon pricing. But the reality is it's still remarkably unpopular, and depending on the election in the fall, it might be scrapped entirely due to that unpopularity. So my question is, if Liberal Canada can't successfully implement a carbon pricing tool that's not really that high of a carbon price and includes all of these policy elements that you explicitly recommend in your presentation, how do we expect that less liberal nations or developing countries have any realistic chance of adopting carbon pricing at a high enough price that would actually drive meaningful emission reductions?
Thank you very much. Second question for Jan. Please.
My name is Ron Hannesson. I'm from Norway, the Norwegian School of Economics. And my question is directed at Ms. Wilson. You told us that foreign policy was the prerogative of the federal government. And yet, we have now heard about cooperation between the state of California and Quebec. And I also know that the state of California has been keeping a high profile in some foreign countries. They've been in Norway, among other things, and I don't think they have entered any obligatory cooperation with the Norwegian government, but they have certainly kept a high profile and a lot of hot air. So my question is, what degrees of freedom does the state of California have, or other American states for that matter, to pursue their own climate policy?
Thank you very much. And the Last question, please.
John Ballantyne, Brandeis University. I would like to take this to frame the carbon pricing within our open plenary session, whether we should be pursuing second best solutions and that they may be more politically feasible across the world rather than just sticking with the first best efficiency argument of carbon pricing. I think that we had a convincing, provocative set of questions proposed that opening session.
Thank you very much. It's not exactly a question, it's more a comment. So I will ask a question for Onil. On the Quebec and California, you presented the targets for Quebec in terms of greenhouse gas reduction. How do you harmonize your targets between Quebec and California? Do you need to harmonize your target, or do you set up your target independently and then afterward you see how the market responds to those targets? Because I could imagine two provinces or two states linked with carbon market, and if one of the players have a very much more ambitious targets than the others, how would react the other, So we had many very interesting question, and it remains 10 minutes to our panelists to answer those questions. Who want to start and who want to continue? Maybe Jan, you can start.
Oh, okay, yeah. Well, no, there's a very good questions on the political acceptability of carbon pricing. I mean, we have to be real. If you're serious about a 2 degrees Celsius target, we need to have global carbon prices of around $75 per ton by 2030. The current global average price is $2. So, I mean, being realistic, we're not going to have a global carbon price of $75 per ton by 2030, I don't think. So, I think we have to be creative at both domestic and international levels and try and think of mechanisms to scale up ambition, and that may mean going to other instruments that are not first best, are not carbon pricing, but perhaps have more political traction. So that's why we've been suggesting this fee-based approach, which can reduce emission rates in the power sector, the transport sector. You can increase energy efficiency with this approach, and it doesn't involve a big increase in energy prices because there's no pass-through of carbon tax revenue in higher energy prices. So it avoids big burdens on households, avoids big competitiveness impacts. So perhaps this might have more political traction. It's just, I mean, we can't judge what's more political acceptable in one country or another. We can just lay out the options and the trade-offs. So ideally, countries would be doing carbon pricing, and we can suggest strategies for trying to enhance the acceptability of that, making visible use of the revenues, making productive use of the revenues. But it's all very difficult to project. I mean, China's not going to introduce a big tax on carbon emissions if other G20 countries are not going to do that. So we also we need to think creatively at the international level about what's going to help scale up ambition. At the moment, we're just stuck with this unilateral approach, and to be honest, there aren't strong incentives for countries acting unilaterally to rapidly scale up their mitigation ambition. I don't see China and India unilaterally, substantially tightening their mitigation pledges if no one else is. Even though we do emphasize that there would be a lot of local health benefits from doing that. So that's why we're trying to suggest that policymakers consider these additional mechanisms that are built into the Paris Agreement, such as carbon price floor arrangements. But it's just very difficult to predict how this is all going to work out. I think there is a catalyzing effect. If some countries do move ahead with carbon pricing successfully, it does encourage others. So there's a lot of path dependency of different countries, but we just don't know how it's going to work out. So we have to be pragmatic, think about all possible options, think creatively about how to improve the acceptability of all these different options. Just on the net benefit calculations, those are just purely on the cost side. We were just purely looking at losses in consumer surplus in fuel markets from carbon pricing. and then we were just comparing those with the domestic environmental benefits, so quantifying how many air pollution deaths would be saved from cutting back on use of coal and petroleum and so on, and then valuing that using a value of life. So that's what was underlying those calculations.
Thank you. Augusta, yes, you were asked by our Norway colleagues.
Yeah, to answer the question about California and sort of state authority to do these kinds of things in the foreign arena generally. Yeah, it's a great question. I will tell you that as I started to dive into potential legal arguments that could be raised against a state like California that wished to enter into an agreement like this, and considered the fact that California had already been doing this across an international border with Quebec for years, I was pretty shocked and remained very surprised. I remain to this day very surprised that they've never been sued on the ground, on the basis of any of the things that I sort of ran through. Because to me, I find it very surprising. No one has done that. California has been challenged on some other grounds for its participation in the Western Climate Initiative, but mostly focused on whether or not this constitutes a tax in violation of California's own sort of set of rules. So I find it pretty fascinating that it hasn't happened. I think it's worthwhile to consider these issues just because, if this starts to grow, if there is sort of a catalytic effect, if we do see more states starting to participate, more foreign jurisdictions, if other Canadian provinces, Mexico start to join this picture, I think if it got bigger, you might see more robust challenges. But so, I think I will also just say quickly about California, which has, as you were referencing, been really one of the leaders, even on the international stage, in a lot of ways on climate change. They've really decided we are going to set really aggressive policies in a lot of different areas. We are going to be out there, sort of presenting ourselves as a leader. And so, one of the big legal issues in the U.S. has been emission standards for cars, because California. So people know this. I'm not telling you things you don't know, but there have been a lot of challenges, I think, around can California decide we're going to set our own standard, and they've mostly come out pretty well on top of those, and they are continuing to push forward. And I think that really does come down to, as I was sort of at least hinting at, this idea that states do have a pretty big body of residual authority, and especially if policies like this, and it doesn't just have to be carbon markets, carbon tax, other greenhouse gas emissions related policies are framed such that they really focus on state traditional areas of authority, the state regulating its own economy, its own environment. They've been pretty successful, and I think they can actually probably go pretty far. That's how I would answer that question. It's an interesting one.
Thank you. May I add one question? In Europe, as you said, the legal issues are very different if you consider ETS or tax. Mm-hmm. What would happen in the US if, I don't know, for example, Ohio or one state wanted to set up its own carbon tax?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that it could be complicated, but it may well be possible. The first thing that comes to my mind in thinking about what would likely be the response to that is, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but we have, and I talked about it a little bit, although I know everything was really brief, but we have what is referred to as the Commerce Clause. We have this clause in our Constitution, and I don't know how much this may apply in other countries, but this is sort of a long-standing principle of U.S. law that it is, as I was referencing, Congress's exclusive authority to regulate commerce between states. And so as well as commerce between, as well as foreign commerce, but also commerce between any two states or multiple states. And so the thing that I think might be very complicated about that is that energy grids are completely interconnected. It's difficult to establish a tax in one state without affecting commerce in many other states. And so I think that would probably be the most likely area of legal difficulty, is establishing that you're not violating that clause by setting up this tax, which has implications elsewhere.
Interesting. Onil, you were asked on the how to set up different targets when you are linked.
Yeah. Well, first, both Quebec and California signed under two MOU, so we basically have the same long-term objective to reduce emissions by 80 to 95% by 2050. So we basically have kind of the same target or objective. But in terms of implementing an ETS, it's not that much the target itself that needs to be aligned, but it's more the caps. So the caps have to be harmonized or to be aligned in some way so that they translate in a mitigation effort that is similar in one jurisdiction than in the other. So, for example, it's not the exact number of the target for 2030 or 2020 that is relevant when comparing one jurisdiction to the other. It's basically to put it simply, it's basically the slope of the decrease from the starting point to the end point. So if I can add an example on this, California 2020 target, it's to reach the same level than its 1990 emission, while in Quebec it's a 20% reduction. So it could appear as it is different, but it's not if you consider that emissions in California went way up from 1990 to 2005 or something, and that from that point, reducing their emissions, it translates to it's similar to the effort that we have to make in Quebec. And I just wanted to add one other remark on a different topic. We talk a lot about carbon pricing and how can we drive the price up. If you noticed in my presentation, in the results slide, I didn't mention the price, the carbon price. It's for us, it's not an indicator of is the market doing well or not. Basically, if the price, in our view, if the price is low, is down, it's because the emitters reduce their emissions, so they don't need to buy a lot of allowances. So in our view, it's a good sign that the price it doesn't go too much up.
Thank you very much. It was a question which was a lot discussed in Europe with the EU ETS price. So I'm afraid we arrive at the end of this session. Unfortunately, because we could continue the discussion very long, but time is running. I would like to thank all our panelists. I would like to thank the organizers of this conference, because it's always a pleasure to be in Montreal, but really it's more a pleasure to be in this Hautes Études Commerciales, and congratulations for the organization. I think that all the issues we have started to discuss today on the link between the energy economy and the climate economy and the carbon pricing is major issues. So I'm sure that your association will continue to invest on those topics, and I'm sure that next year in the conference of this association, which will be held not in Montreal, but in Paris, which is also a nice city, we will continue discuss on those topics. Well, thank you to everybody. It was a pleasure.